We're giving it maybe a few more seconds here. It takes people just a couple minutes to get on. We don't want anyone to miss our esteemed guest today, Heather O'Loughlin from the Montana Budget and Policy Institute, and we're thrilled to have her here. So we're just getting ready to start here in a couple minutes. I hope everyone's doing great on this Tuesday, day after Love Day, Valentine's Day. Love is love, and I hope you all had someone to express some love to yesterday, even if it was just yourself. Hopefully it was a good day. We are about getting ready to start here. I think we will go ahead and do that. So welcome everyone. Let's go. Hi everyone, I'm Kimberly Dudick, the co-founder and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies, and I'm here today with my co-founder and CFO, Sophie Moon. It's nice to see you all. We're hosting these Tuesday talks as a chance to bring attention to under-addressed issues in Montana, letting you know some of the great people working on these issues, and also giving you an opportunity to learn how to get involved. There's also a chance to ask questions that you want answers to, so it's a great chance to really find out the things you want to know. These talks are recorded, and attendees can post questions in a chat box. You can chat back and forth also. We also have a Q&A box if you want to send questions directly to us. We will try to answer as many of these as possible towards the end of our talk. So today I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Heather O'Loughlin. She is the co-director of the Montana Budget and Policy Center. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks for having me.
Oh gosh, we're so thrilled to have you here. Heather came to the Montana Budget and Policy Center in 2014 as the research director. Prior to that, Heather served as legislative director and counsel for U.S. Senator Max Baucus, managing the senator's legislative team. Previously, she served as legislative assistant for the senator, handling a broad policy portfolio, including education, judiciary, banking, and economic issues. She received her JD at the University of Montana School of Law, me too, congrats, and her BA in economics and a BS in business administration and finance from the University of Montana. Heather lives in Helena with her husband and daughter, and I've had the pleasure of working with Heather while I've been in the legislature up until last year. So it's been wonderful getting to know her. So hi, Heather. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
You are welcome. And you know, I did make a mistake earlier. I called this the Montana Budget and Policy Institute. It's not an institute. You are from the Montana Budget and Policy Center. So we want to make sure we get that right. It's MBPC. So if you're going to Google them, that's the correct way to do it. So Heather, thank you so much for being with us. What can you tell us, maybe give us, tell us a little bit about yourself before we really dig into the questions.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Great Falls, and spent some time out in Washington, D.C., as you mentioned, working for Senator Baucus. Was really pleased that I could come back to Montana. I had my daughter, and then came back to Montana just when she was a few months old, and have been with Montana Budget and Policy Center since then. So this is my fourth legislative session with MBPC, which is kind of hard to believe. And yeah, have just always really enjoyed working on policy and really thinking about how policies impact, Montanans and families across the state.
So tell us about your work and why is it so important?
So Montana Budget and Policy Center, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization. We focus primarily on state tax and budget policies and look at how those policies impact low and moderate income families in Montana. We were created in 2008, I think a little bit in recognition that in order to advance good sound policy, you really have to fully understand what the implications of those policies are. And so we were created in 2008, and I think have been able to share sound research and policy recommendations to legislators like yourself back back when you were there about what policies might mean for families across the state. So a big portion of what we do is track the state budget process, which is a complex, convoluted process. Kim, you sat on appropriations during your time, and it is unlike other bills and other policy bills that move through the legislative session. So we spend a fair amount of time in the subcommittees tracking the state budget and really sharing out with partner organizations and with the broader public what those budget decisions will mean for programs and for communities across the state. The other big component of the work that we do is in tax committees and really looking at how tax policy might impact families, but also thinking about connecting these dots, right? The tax revenue that we collect as a state is really the funding that we use to invest in infrastructure and education, in health services for families across the state. So a lot of what we do are really connecting those two components of the legislative process.
Well, it's really important. And I recall when I was there, your work was essential when we looked at Medicaid expansion and how that could help so many Montana citizens, but also the communities and the hospitals, especially rural hospitals. I know we looked at that information a lot, so it's really important. So what kind of an impact have you been able to make?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Medicaid expansion is a perfect example of the work that we've done. Montana, through really the incredible work of many, many legislators and advocates across the state, expanded Medicaid in 2015. We spent a lot of time working on Medicaid expansion. We also then reauthorized Medicaid expansion in this last legislative session. So we shared details on, what Medicaid expansion would mean for families. We provide county level data on the number of families eligible or accessing Medicaid expansion, the number of preventative services that have been provided through Medicaid expansion. And so really just getting data out there about what the value and the importance is of expansion has been a role that we have played. I would say one other thing that I think we're particularly proud of, Montana in 2017 established a state earned income tax credit. We became the 27th state in the nation to essentially create a credit that mirrors the successful federal EITC that really was a direct benefit to low income working families in Montana. So that was a bill that now Senator Jacobson carried, but many, many other legislators before him, Representative Cafaro, Senator Kaufman, really advocated and championed the value of creating an earned income tax credit in Montana. So that was another, I think, thing that we've really are proud that we were able to help get across the finish line a few sessions ago.
Just to comment on something you said there, that many people had tried this before. And I think that's something to keep in line when we're watching the legislature, is it's definitely a marathon and not a sprint. And sometimes it takes more than one chance to really get these things passed. And nothing is permanent also is something else to keep in mind. Like if horrible decisions happen now, nothing is permanent. So moving on to now, what are some of the issues that you've been spending most of your time on?
So we've been spending a fair amount of time on in tax committees. There are a number of bills, with a change in administration. I think there's certainly a new set of priorities that Governor Gianforte has brought forward. A big one of those is cutting taxes, both in the short term and in the long term. We see tax cut measures each session and spend a fair amount of time talking to legislators about what their colleagues in appropriations and the budget committees are up against, the necessary investments that we as a community really need to make. And that's where we're spending a lot of our time this session. A couple of the bills that just were heard last week that we are tracking are in the Senate, Senate Bill 159, which is a proposal to cut Montana's top income tax rate. Montana's income tax is a progressive income tax structure, though it has become relatively flat with legislation that passed a couple decades ago. And this legislation would cut that top rate from 6.9% to 6.75%, costing the state about $30 million per year in lost revenue. The lion's share of that benefit would go to high income earners who have more income in that top rate. And so we've estimated that about 80% of the benefit would go to the wealthiest 20% of households. So that is a measure that we're tracking and concerned about what it might mean for our ability to invest in the long run. There is also another bill, Senate Bill 182, which was also heard last week in Senate Tax Committee, that would essentially trigger additional income tax cuts in the future. So it's a complicated proposal, but it essentially sets up a new fund where excess revenue would be deposited in and then would trigger further reductions to that top income tax rate. So certainly could have pretty significant ramifications on revenue in the long run. And you know, we've seen these types of proposals in other states, and you know, have certainly in many instances hamstrung states' ability to invest in the long run.
So I want to dig into that a little bit because I find it really interesting. When you talk about that, for the last couple of decades, there was a change made where now it's almost a flat tax. And what do you really mean? So when somebody's paying taxes, that top tax bracket, what is the earning revenue of the lowest in that and the highest? What is that range?
Yeah, so Montana had a more progressive income tax structure prior to 2003. The legislature under Governor Martz changed the income tax and essentially collapsed the income tax bracket and lowered the top rate from 11% to 6.9%. Today, someone who is making a little more than $18,000 a year is hitting that top income tax bracket. So essentially, those who are making, you know, $19,000, $20,000 a year are seeing the same top tax rate as someone who is making, you know, $500,000 or $1 million. So we do have some progressivity still in our income tax, but it certainly is flatter than it was prior. And again, what we saw in 2003 is the lion's share of that benefit went to those high income earners.
Now, the budget director that is with the current administration, is that the same one who was with Governor Martz when she was governor?
He was in the administration, but not as the budget director.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so what kind of, let's see, we've been talking about the things that you're tracking. What other budget proposals are there in the legislature, and what are they going to mean for Montanans?
Well, I think that, you know, the legislature is right now in the process of going through their big budget bill, House Bill 2. This upcoming week, and really some subcommittees have started taking action already, but we will see action on the budget over the next week or so in those subcommittees. We'll see how those conversations go. I think that what we've been hearing, you know, from the public and from stakeholders that have been providing public comments, you know, there's, I think, many areas where the state hasn't yet invested adequately. And so, Department of Health and Human Services is a particular area that we track closely. A lot of conversations around the budget cuts that were taken in 2017 and the loss of mental health providers, behavioral health services, that I think, in many ways, there are some measures to start to build up that infrastructure. But I think what we continue to hear is there's just continued demand for those services. A big part of this is really providing Medicaid reimbursement to those health providers that are taking Medicaid patients. Montana has one of the lower Medicaid provider rates or reimbursement rates in the region. And that has been a topic of conversation. How can we really ensure that we have providers particularly in rural communities that are providing, home and community-based services, behavioral health services, services for adults and children with disabilities, really some of the most vulnerable populations in our communities, and really ensuring that we have providers in those areas. And so I think that's going to be a continued conversation. We'll see the subcommittee that is in charge of Department of Public Health and Human Services budget will begin to take executive action later this week. I think they're starting on Thursday. And so we'll see how those conversations go. There's no question that, I think what that subcommittee is hearing is that there is really a inadequate supply of services in many areas of the state. I think it's just going to be a question of how and the extent to which the legislature is willing to invest the resources needed.
Okay, and you talked a little bit about tax cuts, and one thing we've been hearing is that this will help grow our economy, which would be great. So what information do you have about that, and what do you want people to understand about that?
Yeah, so this has definitely been a talking point and an argument by proponents that Montana has an income tax rate that is higher than some of our neighboring states. I think that I would say, one, it's important to think about our tax system as a whole. So Montana does not have a statewide sales tax. That is a tremendous benefit and really helps us reduce the regressivity of our tax structure. If you think about those at lower income levels, the sales tax certainly hits low and moderate income families at a greater rate than higher income households. So I think it's important to think about our tax system as a whole. I think the other thing that I would say is, what type of economic growth are we really talking about? And many of those states that either have no income tax or a lower income tax, that lack of sustainable revenue over time has resulted in pretty significant budget cuts in many of those states. Arizona is one state that has been talked about. Arizona has faced a significant crisis in lack of investments in K-12 education, where you see in many communities across Arizona, classroom sizes of over 30 students each. And I think that's is that what we're really aspiring to, right? Arizona has actually, the voters really took this into their own hands and last year passed a ballot initiative that added a surcharge on high income earners. And so invest in pumping that new money into K-12 education. So I think, I think one thing I would just say is we should look at our tax system as a whole. We should see really who's being impacted, both by our tax structure, but also who ultimately would benefit from these tax cut proposals. I think the other thing, that was really well discussed last week is this concept sort of the old school mantra of trickle down economics, right? If we provide a tax cut to high income folks or wealthy folks, more wealthy folks will come into the state and it will trickle down and grow the economy. The reality is that that has not been the case in other states. States that have cut income taxes actually haven't seen growth above and beyond national averages. And we know from data in Montana that when we cut income taxes in 2003, it did not result in a measurable, influx in migration of high income earners. What I think we would say is that, we should be investing, right? Like there is no question that there are things the state can and should be doing to invest in broadband, in need-based aid for colleges and university, for families, wanting to access colleges, talking about the value of a strong public education system. Those are the things that ultimately attract new businesses and attract people to a state. And I think that what we've seen in other states is that, cuts to taxes that will ultimately jeopardize the investments we make will work against us in the long run.
So one more question about just the tax part of it all. If there are these tax cuts to the higher income tax brackets, and there is no real reduction in services, which I don't think many of us really want to see, who backfills those taxes? Because the money needs to be there somehow. So how does that backfilling of taxes happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, there's certainly a couple different ways in how we fund core government services. The state has, picks up some of that tab. Much of it is local governments, right? And local schools. We have seen this play out in other instances where the legislature may cut or fail to adequately invest in certain programs that ultimately shifts that pressure on local governments and local property taxpayers, right? So when you think about school infrastructure and the demands that many schools are facing, that ultimately is being borne on a local level. And I think that, we certainly hear concerns about the levels of property taxes. And I think that there's a connection there, right? When the state is not adequately investing in mental health services or public safety, local governments are in many instances having to make difficult choices in how to provide those services.
All right. So, we're going to be wrapping things up here, and then I'm going to turn you over to Sophie for some questions from the audience. But first, how can people get involved with the work you're doing? We've posted your contact information in the chat box, so people please look there. But how can they become involved, Heather?
Yeah, great question. So montanabudget.org is our website. We have a lot of information on our website. We provide, policy basic reports on our tax structure, on the importance in investing in health services. And so I would certainly encourage folks to take a look at our reports on our website. We also have a way for folks to sign up for a monthly newsletter that we do, and so we would certainly encourage folks to sign up for that. We provide a recap on what is happening up at the legislature and what we will be focused on in the weeks ahead. So I think that's another great way for folks to engage. Our contact information is on our website too, and so it's always great. I mean, we often say, we're like the wonky numbers policy folks, but this work isn't possible without us really helping to share the personal stories of why these policies matter for families across the state. And so we love to hear from folks. We work with a number of partner organizations that do grassroots efforts and field work. And so we're always connecting folks with them as well to help really elevate the personal stories of why these policies matter.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Now I'm going to turn over to Sophie to ask some of the great questions people have been putting in the chat box and in the Q&A box. And these are the questions that people would like some answers to. So go ahead, Sophie.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thank you so much, Heather, for joining us today. If anyone has any more questions to ask, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them before the end of our time today. So the first question, is your organization tracking the policy pathway that Governor Gianforte is following compared to the pathway followed by Republicans in a state like Kansas?
Yeah, so this definitely is tied to some of the income tax proposals that we've seen. You know, again, there is a proposal to actually trigger future income tax cuts if revenue grows at a certain level. And I think those types of things we have seen in states like Kansas. You know, Kansas is an interesting story and would certainly encourage folks to take a look at a recent op-ed that I think made its way into many of the papers in Montana from the former Republican majority leader in Kansas, talking about what the impact of those tax cuts meant for services in the state. You know, the income tax bill that we have in front of us, or that the legislature has in front of them right now, would cut about $60 million each biennium. So a pretty significant cut. And I think that the bill, Senate Bill 182, which would trigger future cuts, could create a significant impact on our ability to invest over time. So it's definitely something that we've been elevating. I think Kansas is one of those stories where we saw what the impact of sort of this experiment of let's cut taxes and see if it grows our economy. And the reality is that is not what happened. In fact, you know, many organizations from the business community to, you know, construction to the nonprofit sector really stepped up and said, enough is enough. We can't afford this. They actually ended up, I think, one year having to shut down K-12 schools early for lack of funding. And so you can see how dire this gets. And I certainly think that those are the types of cautionary tales that we're sharing with policymakers.
Great, thank you for that. So the next question, do you have talking points regarding how Gianforte's tax plan actually affects each tax bracket? You mentioned them, but I'd love to have them available to share, maybe fact sheets on the results of tax cuts, et cetera.
Yeah, so we do have a report that we released early last week that is on our website that details out what the impact of these tax cuts would mean on households. We work with a national organization called the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy that models out the impact of various tax proposals in states. And we provide a little bit of detail on what they would project for who would ultimately benefit from that. So I don't have it off the top of my head, but essentially those, you know, that are at $23,000 to $40,000 in income would see an average tax cut of about $1 a year, whereas those who are in the wealthiest 1% of households in Montana, or those making more than about $500,000, would see an average tax cut of about $1,300, $1,300 a year. But we provide a lot of detail on the breakout of who you know, what those tax cuts look like at various income levels in that report.
thank you for that. And I went ahead and posted a link to your resource page in our chat too, if people want to visit that. Next question is more of a voting rights issue, but it does influence tax issues as well. What are your thoughts on Brad Cheetah's HB 240? It's more of a voting rights bill, but it has significant ramifications tax-wise for dependents and college students.
Yeah, so this bill would essentially limit an individual's ability to register to vote if they are claimed as a dependent by their parent. Certainly concerning from a voting rights perspective. You think about, our tax system and really our voting structure allows for someone who is living temporarily in another area to register to vote in that area. This could limit it. I think it also, from a tax standpoint, creates a fair amount of complexity for a taxpayer. I think about for a CPA having to verify where a dependent may or may not be registered to vote. So it's a bill that we have opposed, and that many of the organizations that work on engaging young people in the process have also raised concerns about.
Great. So our next question, what is the best way to get this messaging to the Montanans that voted for this administration and legislature? I'm assuming they're talking about tax messaging. And what is the Montana Budget and Policy Center's strategy for doing so?
So I definitely think that, the average voter, I would say two things. One, one thing that we've talked with voters about our tax structure as a whole. And I think that there is certainly concerns around the levels of property taxes in some communities. We hear much less about income taxes. I think that really helping folks understand who ultimately would benefit from these proposals is really important. I think that when you share out, who ultimately is receiving a tax cut under these proposals, folks think, well, that doesn't seem fair. And this is doing nothing potentially to address, I think, the growing regressivity or inequities around property values and access to safe and affordable housing. I think the other thing that I would say that, I think voters really understand the importance of the investments that we make in our local communities, right? Like it's harder to really quantify it on a statewide or national level, but people understand the importance of their public school in their community, right? So from the standpoint of educating their children and their neighbors' children to being that in many rural areas, the community center of that community. So I think localizing things has been something that we try to do as much as possible. So looking at the impact of budget cuts or investments in our budget on a local level, right? Like what is happening in a particular county with access to mental health services? Where are those gaps in your community? And then how can we ensure that we're investing the dollars to improve those services? So I would say those are the two things that we strive for, is really localized information and really articulating who ultimately is benefiting from these proposals.
So we have a quick follow-up to that one. Sorry to jump ahead for the rest of the questions in line, but I want to tag this on while we're still on this note. One of our panel or participants just asked, what specifically is your organization's strategy for delivering that message?
So I will say that we are one of many, many organizations that are up at the legislature. So we certainly rely a lot on our partners to help paint the picture of what this means. We do testify on legislation that impacts low-income families, but we work with a number of organizations that are really on the ground talking to voters. So much of the work that we do is helping to share out this information in a way that other organizations can share and use it with their members or with the broader public. I think that I think about the voices that we've been hearing on these tax cut measures, and we can provide the nitty gritty, policy analysis, but it is hugely helpful for legislators to hear about the connection between, the struggles of behavioral health providers or folks who serve adults and children with disabilities and accessing those services. We've had, folks from food banks, from the K-12 space, share out what those levels of investments really that are needed in Montana. So in many ways, our work is really to help arm those that are on the ground with the data that they need to talk with both voters and with policymakers.
Great. So depending on this question's answer, this will probably be our last question. This participant is wondering if Gianforte's tax policy is the first step in getting a sales tax in Montana. So kind of a long-term, what is your analysis of the strategy here?
So I don't know. There have been discussions about a sales tax over the last several sessions. We saw a bill proposed in the last two sessions by former Representative Carrie White to essentially create a statewide sales tax, as well as eliminate certain types of property taxes. That legislation did not make it through the House. A fairly healthy debate and discussion about revenue adequacy and the revenue types that Montana should have. I think, the majority of legislators in the House, did not support a statewide sales tax. And I think that there are many, many folks that voiced concerns about a sales tax. What I would say is, I think that we should look at our tax structure as a whole. Efforts to create a statewide sales tax has really been an effort to eliminate either income tax or property tax in Montana, which would, one, not address sort of the growing needs in services and investments in our community, but it also would make our tax structure and our tax system more inequitable and more regressive. So a sales tax ultimately hits lower and middle income families at a higher rate than higher income when you look at it as a share of income. And so, I think those are things that have been discussed. I don't know, if ultimately that's the direction. I do think that the efforts to cut taxes today will likely result in very difficult budget choices tomorrow. And that ultimately puts future legislatures in the precarious place of saying, do we raise taxes and raise revenue in a way that may not be inequitable, or do we cut the budget? And so I think that there's no question that these tax cut proposals will make the budgeting process more difficult in the future. And I think make it harder to invest in, things that we've fallen behind in: early childhood education, affordable housing, behavioral health services. So things that I think that policymakers are talking about. I think we ultimately are, in a tougher place to make those investments.
Well, thank you so much for answering all of our listener questions. Sorry for everyone who didn't get their question answered. We had a really good response for this talk. And so, we just try to get through everything we can and stay on a good schedule here. And for the last part of the talk, I'm going to turn it over to Kim for our final 4 questions.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks, Heather, for answering those questions. I'd like to encourage everyone who wants to hear more about the work that Heather and Policy Center is doing to go to their website at montanabudget.org. They have contact information there. You can send them a question if you didn't get it answered here, and they have a lot of ways to get involved. So please make sure that you follow up if you really want to. So now we have our final 4 questions. These are intended to let people get to know Heather a little bit more and kind of outside of just the work that she's doing. So Heather, what's a podcast that you're listening to that you would recommend to others?
Well, I've been really enjoying The Session, which is a podcast that a number of the Capitol Beat reporters across the state have been doing in coordination with each other. And so I think that Yellowstone Public Radio, Montana Public Radio, and Montana Free Press are doing that one. I think The Lead is another one. And so I'm often checking to see what's on their radar. And they're just both great little snippets of what's happening up at the session. The other one that's not Montana or session related, but I think it just has been such a great thing for my own learning and I think provides a lot of great context and information is Code Switch, which is been on for quite some time now, but I always look forward to downloading the latest from them as well.
Yeah, those are great ones. All right, now who's your favorite singer?
So I feel like my taste in music has not necessarily evolved over time, but I started listening to Ani DeFranco when I was, in high school, in the mid 90s, and she, continues to be a wonderful artist that I enjoy.
There's worse artists from the 90s that you could still be
listening totally
to. Where's your favorite place to go in Montana?
Well, certainly, I feel really lucky to be in Helena and this close to the mountains. So we are places right at the base of Mount Ascension. And so we try to get out and hike as much as possible, though it's been a little chilly. And then my family growing up, my dad got a small little cabin just southeast of Great Falls, which I have such fond memories of going. It's right along Bell Creek, and that now is, I think, been amazing to have with my own daughter, and the ability to create memories with her now there as well. So anywhere outdoors, though, really.
And what's the best advice you were ever given?
I feel like there's just been so many amazing people in my life that have shared advice. I think I got engaged in policy work in college, but before that, had a pretty interesting experience when I was younger, and saw sort of a level of discrimination that surprised me and really frustrated me. And my dad said right out of the gate, "We'll do something about it." And it's something that stuck with me, that when you see something that that you don't agree with, or someone that's been wronged, I have the ability to use my voice and to do something. And so that's advice that I've always carried with me.
Well, those are inspiring words, Heather. Thank you so much for being on with us today. We really appreciated having you here.
Thank you. Really nice to see you, Kim, and thanks for having me.
You bet. Thank you so much. All right, everyone, that's our show for today. Thank you all for attending. Please check out their website if you want. You can contact us at info@ppir.org. To everyone listening, thank you for listening. We're hosting these talks to provide an opportunity to hear about the great people working on different issues in our state and how you can become involved. And if you would like, these will be recorded and released at a later date, so you can hear them in a podcast and maybe also on television. So that may be something new coming your way also. Thank you all so much, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks so much.